I'm not going to introduce our special guest speaker. Instead, I'm going to introduce somebody else who's going to introduce our special guest speaker. Dr. Catherine Beckett is a very special friend of the CLO. Her work on issues regarding the criminal justice system is world-renowned, and she graciously gives of her time to occasionally come to a Monday night CLO meeting so that we can be a part of that ongoing discussion about justice reform. She most likely does not know the impact that she has on us, but I'm here to tell you it is profound. Dr. Beckett introduced us to our special guest today, and so we'll invite her up here to introduce you all to our special guest. Dr. Beckett.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here today. This is my third CLO conference, and I just want to thank you all for taking the time to put together such thoughtful and thought-provoking programs every time. And I'm really inspired by the public speaking capacities that I see. You guys are amazing, so thank you. I am really happy that Ayoola Mitchel is with us today. I had the pleasure of meeting Ayoola in the Bay Area when I went down with a colleague and friend, Martina Cartman, to learn more about the Insight Prison Project. The Insight Prison Project, which Ayoola will tell us more about, is started in San Quentin and is now working in prisons and jails all over the state of California. They run a tremendous array of programs, but including programs that are offered for people on the inside and ultimately involve people on the inside either meeting the person that they harmed or people who experience similar kinds of harms. So the work involves the very kind of dialogue and kind of exchanging of stories that's been going on today. Ayoola is the IPP Community and Survivor Outreach Specialist. She was born and raised in San Francisco in a law enforcement family, and she became interested in the criminal justice system quite early. She obtained her degree at San Jose State University and then went on to study correctional education at the graduate level at Santa Clara University. She's spent many years working in the criminal justice system in a wide range of capacities, so she draws on just a tremendous wealth of experience. She has worked in victim services. She's been an educator, a facilitator, a litigation support professional, an investigator, a mitigation specialist for people on death row, and an advocate. When she first came to IPP, she served as a volunteer on the Survivor Speaker, and as I'm sure she will share with you all today, she's been gradually pulled further and further and further in. That seems to be the MO at IPP. She's also currently working with Californians for Safety and Justice, and she works as well for the San Francisco County Sheriff's Department, where she oversees and develops programs inside the San Francisco County Jail. So please join me in welcoming Ayoola Mitchel.
Hi. So first I want to say, how many Seahawk fans are in here? So despite the whooping y'all put on us last Sunday, I still came. I thought about not coming, but I still came. Where do I begin? First, I want to say thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. I never take invitations to speak, to talk about the work that I do, to tell my story. I never take that for granted. I'm always humbled and honored by the opportunity to not so much talk about me, but talk about my life and my story as it relates to your lives, your stories, and the work. So before I get into it, I want to say to the gentleman who talked about being state raised, recently I spent 2 years working in the child welfare system in San Francisco County, and I came running back to jails and prisons because I just could not with that system. And my heart goes out to you for what you have gone through being state raised, and I'm sure he's not the only one in here. I'm not going to go on a tirade about the child welfare system, But as often as people speak about the school to prison pipeline, they need to talk about the foster care system to prison pipeline as well. So I acknowledge that. Somebody told me there was some tissue up here. I was thinking about shedding tears and how many tears I've shed over the years. And, ironically, I have shed more tears for you men in tan, for the men in California in blue, for the county jail men that I work with in orange, and for the federal prisoners I've worked with in khaki as well. I've shed more tears for you and your stories than I have for my own boys and our story. I have no understanding about a country that imprisons people forever and ever and ever, irregardless of what they've done. I have no understanding of that. And I have gotten surprise and shock after surprise and shock since my arrival yesterday morning. I didn't know that Washington didn't have a parole board. I didn't know that life meant life. And I'm gonna try to be as eloquent and politically correct and diplomatic as I can, but I was sitting there thinking, like, I'm really pissed off about that. Like, I don't understand that. Thank you. I'm gonna try to keep it together, but as you all told your stories, I often tell stories about the work I've done, what I've seen, and what I've experienced. I want to start by saying anger, fear, and pain is untreated trauma. And when it goes untreated, it's going to manifest some kind of way. We're either going to implode or we're going to explode. And when we implode, can I move around? Can you hear me? Okay, so when we implode, that's the harm that we do to ourselves by substance abuse, by self-mutilation, by putting ourselves in compromising situations, by taking chances with our health, our safety, our freedom, and our lives. That's what we do when we implode. When we explode, it's the harm that we do to other people. And that's what results in the prison sentences that most of you have. I was sitting here thinking of an analogy about untreated harm and untreated trauma. And I was thinking about, I have a bunch of children, and my oldest daughter, when she was a little girl, she was having a slumber party, and some kind of way they were playing, she fell, and she cut her arm. And I was a young mom at the time, and I was like, I'm gonna apply some pressure, we're gonna stop the bleeding, I'm gonna put some ointment on, and you're gonna be all right. And from that cut, she has a really ugly scar to this day. And years later, I was told, had she gotten stitches, the scar wouldn't be there, right? And so had those who have experienced trauma as youngsters and coming up gotten treatment, they wouldn't have the scars that have manifested in their behavior that has caused incarceration. But we don't look at that. I want to tell a story about some work that I do in the county jails, and I'm gonna get to my story and I'm gonna get to the work at IPP, but this is really important. I'm working with a young man who's 19 years old. He has a conviction, a gun conviction as a juvenile. He has a gun conviction as an adult. He's 19 years old, and he has 2 open felony cases now. One is a robbery, one is a burglary, and he's looking at prison time. And the DA, where I live, probably doesn't happen here, but the DA where I live is gonna send you to prison, not so much because that's what's in the best interest of society, but he's gonna send you to prison because he can. And so I got involved with this case because this young man is housed in the jail that I work, and we have an alternative sentencing program, and I was asked to work with this young man to see if we can come up with something different. Well, in talking to the young man and in talking to the representative from the alternative sentencing program, I learned that at the age of 11, this young man witnessed a murder. He was in his window at his house, probably minding his own business, looking out the window, because that's what kids do, that's what we all do, right? and he sees a man kill another man. Despite what his family wanted, he made the brave choice to testify. So by the age of 13, he testifies in open court to this murder. The district attorney's office gets their conviction, the man goes to prison, and now they're done with the kid, and he's left to his own devices. He witnessed a murder at the age of 11. He received no counseling, he received no therapy, he received no support. Their idea of relocating the family was moving him from one neighborhood in San Francisco to another. San Francisco is 7 miles by 7 miles. So is that relocation? He didn't get any help. So at the age of 13, he got anger, fear, and pain. So he began getting high. He began cutting school. He began to commit crimes. And then he got his juvenile record. So now here we are, 8 years after he witnessed this murder, the same district attorney's office that he helped gain a conviction is trying to send him to prison. And because I'm not always eloquent, because I'm not always politically correct, I sat in that meeting and I told the representative from the district attorney's office, how dare you? How dare you use this kid for your conviction, didn't provide him any services, didn't get him any help, and then want to imprison him because of the behavior that manifested as a result of what he went through. That's the system that we work in. That's the system that I work in, and that's a system that needs to be changed. Who am I? Catherine read a little bit about my background. I was born and raised in San Francisco. My dad was a cop for 38 years. His brother was a cop for 40 years. His brother was the chief of police. My stepmother was a district attorney investigator. My stepfather was a probation officer. So when we say I came from a family of law enforcement, yes, I did. And early on, I made the decision that I wanted to work with those that had been incarcerated. I wanted to work with offenders. Needless to say that decision didn't go too well in my family, but here I am. And so I've been working in this system for a very long time. I worked on my first death penalty case back in 1987. So in the 32 years that I've worked in the criminal justice system, I have seen many, many things, none of which have been good. I have seen the age of kids in California tried as adults lowered from 16 to 14. At the time, I was working in juvenile hall as a counselor, and these kids whose brains are not developed, these kids who cannot vote, they cannot drive, they cannot buy cigarettes legally, they cannot drink, they cannot enter into a contract, are being sent to prison for longer periods of time than they've been on earth. And they're being sent to adult prisons. So I had enough, and I quit, and I went back to grad school, and I began teaching. And the interesting thing that happened was when I quit working in juvenile hall to teach in incarcerated settings, I took a huge pay cut. And again, what kind of society do we live in where you will pay me more to lock them up than to educate them? I believe that systems need to change, and I believe that we can actually change them. So I have worked as a juvenile counselor, I've worked as an investigator, I have worked on death row inmates' appeals, I have seen the number of prisons in California grow to 33. In the same period of time, we built one university. Our priorities in this country are messed up. I came to IPP, I guess about 3 years ago. But before let me back up a little bit. Back in 2009, I was working at our church, and I was working as a private investigator. We were in trial on a homicide case in Oakland, and it was a Friday night. I knew the next day I had a series of interviews that I needed to conduct. I was up late preparing for the next day. My oldest son and I both worked at the church. I had said goodnight to him. I knew I wasn't going to see him till Sunday morning at church because, you know, it's Friday night. He's 22. That's what they do. And so I'm up late. Like I said, I'm working, and I'm getting ready to go to bed, and I look at my phone, and my son's best friend, Travar, has called me. Now, it's not unusual for the boys to call me because I'm nosy, and I'm always up in their business. But it was late, and I listened to the message, and it was just, Mom called me. And when I called him back, he said, did you hear what happened to Benny? And it's amazing to me how fast your brain can think of a bunch of things. I thought, oh, he went to jail. Not because he was involved in criminal behavior, not because he was doing anything illegal, but sometimes 22-year-olds, probably not anybody in this room, can be a little bit irresponsible, and I'm thinking he went to jail over some tickets or a warrant or something crazy like that. And just in a matter of seconds, I'm thinking this, as Travar said to me, Vinny got shot. And I said, what? He said, Vinny got shot. Vinny called me and said, left me a message saying, Var, I've been hit, Ron is dead, they're taking me to Children's Hospital, meet me at the hospital, I love you, man. It's about 11:30 on a Friday night, and I heard what he said, but I'm not really understanding what happened. So I get up, my girlfriend is there, I ask her to watch my younger kids, and I get in my car and I drive to the hospital. And as I get in my car, I make 3 phone calls. I call my prayer partner, because I believe in prayer, and told her, I don't have a lot of information, I just know Benny's been shot, I'm on my way to the hospital, I need you praying, I'll let you know when I have more information. I call his godparents and ask them, could they meet me at the hospital? And I called my oldest daughter, you know, the one that had the cut on the arm, who lives in Southern California, and I say, your brother has been shot. I don't have any information other than that. I need you to get up, get online, get a ticket, because either way it goes, I need you to be here. So as I get in my car and I drive from Antioch, where I was living, to Oakland, where the hospital was, probably about a 40-minute drive, I begin to pray. And as I'm beginning to pray, God speaks to my spirit, and he says, Vinny's not going to die. And I remember thinking, hearing clearly, like you all hear my voice clearly, I heard that's what God said to me. But I'm thinking, okay, he's not going to die, he's going to be paralyzed, he's going to have a Cosby bag, he's going to be all jacked up, but he's not going to die. As soon as I heard in my spirit that he wasn't going to die, I began to pray for the shooter. I had no idea the circumstances. I had no idea who did it. I had no idea if it was 1 or 21 people. I didn't know. I just began to pray for the shooter. Why did I begin to pray for the shooter? Because I wondered, what happened in your life that caused you to be a baby, a toddler, a school-age kid, and now a shooter? See, I understand that something interrupts normal development that causes someone to harm other people. I understood that. I get to the hospital, and my son is in surgery. I still don't have a lot of information. I just know he's in surgery. The social worker tells me it's about 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning. She says that the surgery is probably going to last till about 5 o'clock in the morning. And then they're going to transfer him to a different hospital. So I wait, and by this time, a lot of other family members and friends have come to the hospital, longest 4 hours of my entire life. And finally, about 5 o'clock, 5:15, the surgeon comes out, and he tells me that my son, he described his, the repairs that he had done. He had to remove part of his intestines. He had to repair his liver that had been nicked. He had stopped the internal bleeding, and he told me that there were quite a few bullet fragments that were in his lungs, that it would be actually more dangerous to remove them than to leave them in there. At that point, I still didn't know any details about the shooting. I didn't know how many times he had been shot. I just knew that what they were telling me, barring any unforeseen complications. My son was young, he was healthy. They expected him to have a full recovery. So we get through the night. The next morning, he's transferred to another hospital, and he's in the ICU. As I'm waiting to see him, I'm standing outside his room by the nurse's station, and there's a diagram that it depicts all the wounds. And I only know what this stuff is because of the work that I've done. I've seen diagrams and crime scene photos and just all the stuff. And I'm looking at this diagram, and I'm thinking, so the O's represent entrance wounds and the X's represent exit wounds. And I'm thinking to myself, it shows a lot of X's and O's. And by the location of the X's and O's, I'm thinking to myself, it had to be more than one shooter. What I find out from the nurse is that my son has been shot 17 times. There were 3 shooters. My son was shot, there was an AK-47, a 9mm, and a MAC-10. But he was alive. And one of the first things he said was, God spared me because I had work to do. It was a long journey, his recovery. To this day, if you see him, you couldn't tell that he's been shot, much less 17 times, unless he takes his shirt off. He took 10 bullet wounds to the back, but his spine wasn't hit. So I don't know about y'all, but I believe in miracles, right? I believe in miracles. My son, because of the work that I do, I knew as much as I wanted to know a bunch of stuff, I never asked him any questions. I allowed him to share his story in his time. He has this one wound, a flesh wound that goes right up under his chin. I always wondered, how did he know Ron was dead? Because he tells a story about the truck cutting him off as he was trying to exit a driveway, and the guy starts shooting the AK-47, and the guy stops shooting, and my son gets out the car and starts running. Now, I know my kid, and I know he's not going to leave his boy there. So what was it that he saw that he knew Ron was dead? 5.5 years later, and some therapy later, and a whole lot of support, and a whole lot of love, and a whole lot of support, and some therapy, and a whole lot of love, he was able to tell his story. This wound that grazed his chin, it went into Ron's head. And I share the details of my son's story because I was able to get him some help. I understood his trauma, right? And even though he still lives with the shooting playing on the loop in his head, even though he still lives with chronic pain, mentally and emotionally, he's okay. The one thing criminal justice related that happened to him is because he was afraid, he began carrying a gun. My son didn't carry a gun before that. He had some misdemeanor stuff, but he didn't have any felonies. He wasn't into that. But he began carrying a gun because he was afraid. So now my son has a felony conviction because he was carrying a gun, because he was afraid, right? So we gotta, even though I was able to get him some treatment, we still gotta do better, because there came a point in time where he had exceeded the number of visits he could have with the therapist. I'm going to talk about being trauma-informed in a second as it relates to everybody in the room, as it relates to law enforcement, as it relates to the work that I do, as it relates to the work that y'all do. So 15 months later, after Vinny gets shot, Vinny survived 17 gunshot wounds. Our whole life is different. I've become... my trauma brain has me extra paranoid about the little kids doing normal stuff. No, you can't play outside. No, you can't go to your friend's house. No, you can't walk home from school. Just normal stuff, right? Is trauma. And I've changed. So finally, 15 months later, as I describe it as finally being able to exhale, finally getting adjusted to what was our new normalcy, on Mother's Day of 2010, my middle son was murdered. And I was devastated. Like, there's really no words to even describe it. Coming after what we had went through with Vinny, I was in disbelief, I was in shock. I was working full-time in the jails in San Francisco. I was married to somebody who was incarcerated, so I'm in the jails during the week and I'm at the prison on the weekend. And that contradictory life was making me a little bit crazy. But it's trauma. And because I understood trauma, I knew that I wasn't actually going crazy. This was all a normal result of what I had been through. Deshaun was 19 years old. Deshaun was at an after-hours record release party at some illegal, abandoned, converted warehouse in Oakland. He gets into a verbal altercation with a girl. She makes a phone call. 2 guys come down and they shoot up the whole club. Deshaun was murdered, another young man was murdered, and 6 women were shot. How do you come back from that? How do I reconcile the fact that I've spent my whole career working with the very population who has now caused tremendous harm to my family? It was the first time in my whole career that I thought, I don't want to do this anymore. And then you always got that one friend that just says something just kind of matter-of-factly. I'm not going to say the exact words she used, but basically she was like, what else you going to do? And I thought about that, and I thought about that, and I thought she's right. I know that this work is not what I do, it's who I am. I'm very clear that this is the calling. One of the many, many hats I wear, I'm a minister. And I understand that this work is what God has called me to do. This is my work, this is what I get paid to do, but this is my ministry. And just because trauma and tragedy has impacted my life, that doesn't mean God changed his mind on what he called me to do. So I know one thing. I know probably a couple more than one thing. But the one thing I do know for sure is when trauma and tragedy impacts your life, when your life is completely turned upside down by trauma and or tragedy, you are not the same person. So I heard you men talk about choices. At that juncture, I have a choice. I can be bitter or I could be better. There's no in between, it's one or the other. I met bitter, she ain't that cute. I didn't want to be her. I wanted to be better. And so I made the commitment to be better, to go harder, to do more. And that brought me to the work that I do with Inside Prison Project. As Catherine said, I got hoodwinked, I got bamboozled, I got tricked into doing this work at the level that I'm doing it now. It started off with, can you help out at a volunteer, at our fall fundraiser? Can you volunteer to set up and check people in? I could do that, a few hours out my night, yeah, sure. So I did that. That was in October, like 2 years ago. A couple months later, I get the phone call from my executive director. We had done death penalty work before, so I've been knowing her about 15 years. She calls me, Ayoola, would you be willing to be kind of like my informal advisory council? I said, well, Billy, who's on this council? You. How much time is this going to require, Billy? Not that much. I just, will call you from time to time, get your input on certain things. Okay, I'll do it. I'm just a sucker, right? So then the next thing it becomes, Ayoola, would you mind sitting on the survivor panel and tell your story? Okay, Billy, I'll do it. So I have shared my story numerous times in various arenas, including in the county jail where I work. But for the first time, I was going into a state prison in California to share my story. Now, in the work that I've done, you name a state prison, I've been in it in California, right? Either, like I said, I was married to somebody who had his tour of state prisons, but also in the work that I've done. So I've been in state prisons. It's not a big deal for me to come in prison. But to go in prison and share my story, I wasn't really sure how that was going to be. And let me tell you what happened. It was pretty amazing. In the work we do at IPP, we do restorative justice work. Now, I've heard, may or may not be true, that some of you all may have had some bad experiences in what's called restorative justice. Restorative justice, this is where I gotta actually look at my notes so I make sure I cover everything. Restorative justice is about, the way we do restorative justice at IPP and in California is about creating a safe space, building a container for people to, men in blue, to share their traumas as it relates to their pathology of how they got to the point of where they committed the crime that they're currently incarcerated for, right? And through that process, because we've created a safe place, because we've built a container that offers support and accountability, and it's just safe, they're able to freely talk about their crimes of commitment. And they're able to be accountable. I can't hold you accountable. I can only create a space where you feel safe enough to disclose that which you have done. Because oftentimes, there is a lot of shame, there is a lot of guilt, there is a lot of fear that takes place in you really sharing what you've really done. And I say over and over and over again, nobody should be known for the worst thing they've ever done, because you were somebody before and you've been somebody since. And so that's part of the restorative work that we do. Part of it's also healing, not just for me as a survivor that comes in and shares my story, but for the men who sit in circle, because they're able to really understand those contributory factors that led to the decisions that you made. And jail and prison, as much as we hate it, as much as I am committed to ending mass incarceration, it can save lives. It can give you an opportunity to heal in a way that doesn't take place on the street. I tell the guys that I work with every day in the county jail, you wouldn't come to my class every day on the street, but I got your undivided attention every day, 5 days a week. And you grow and you heal and you learn. And it's restorative in nature. So part of the RJ work that we do, part of the VOLE program, Victor Offender Educational Groups that we do in California, we're currently in 15 facilities in 3 states, 2 county jails, 1 juvenile detention facility, and 3 months ago, a federal judge asked us to bring VOLE into a federal penitentiary. I don't think y'all understand how big that is. We're begging wardens, that's what we call the superintendents in California, wardens, right? We're begging them to let us bring VOLE into the prisons. And for a judge to know the work that we're doing is real and is good, and to ask us to come into the federal prison, that's big. And so starting, I think in November, will be going into the federal prisons. So part of what Vogue does, it is we say it's a 52-week program. We may do a little hoodwinking ourselves because there hasn't been a Vogue program that's lasted 52 weeks. It's more like 18 months, 2 years, 2.5 years. It's a weekly class, 2 hours every week, and you can't rush the process. And so it takes longer than 52 weeks, but we let the men know it's a minimum of 52-week commitment. Most of the time it goes more. So as we get to the end of the Vogue groups, we have survivor panels. And when a survivor comes in to share their story, we represent a surrogate victim for you because the laws in California are pretty similar where, well, not even the laws in California, the policies of the prisons don't allow your actual victim to come in. It has to go through this whole long process, which we do, but it's very difficult because the crime survivor may agree to it, the man in blue may agree to it, and then the warden says no. And so I serve as a surrogate survivor on the panel. So the first time I go into San Quentin to sit on the survivor panel, I just know I'm going in there to tell my story. Okay, I told my story a million times, I'm gonna tell my story. But when we sit in circle and the men introduce themselves, they say their name, their crime of commitment, and how long they've been incarcerated. And I heard 15 years, 18 years, 22 years, 25 years, 28 years, 31 years, 37 years. And I'm like, what? And it broke me down. Because what kind of country do we live in where we're incarcerating our fellow citizens for that amount of time? What are we doing? And at least in California, under the current government, the current governor, guys that have life sentences are coming home. And I get here and I find out y'all don't even have no parole board. I'm devastated. I know I'm not as devastated as you all are, but I'm devastated too. And so that's what the survivor panels do. And they are incredible, right? And when you talk about not being able to apologize I'm not a victim, I'm a crime survivor. My son is not a victim, we're survivors. We have overcome some stuff. The conversation that goes with victim, I don't accept for my story. I don't accept for my family. Because in my opinion, victim is not having overcome and moved forward, right? That's just my opinion. So we're survivors. And one of the things that happens when I tell my story to a room full of men who have caused harm, they are able to hear the harm that they caused from a person who's been harmed. They're able to see that my son could have been your victim, right? Could have been the person who you caused harm to, that I'm the mom of the person, and are able to apologize to me for the harm that they caused, even though they didn't cause it to me. And there's something very cathartic for y'all in that process. And it's very emotional, and it's very healing, and it's very productive, and it's very restorative. And that's why we do it. I've sat on probably 4 survivor panels, and each one, I know what I'm going to hear intellectually, but my heart still breaks every time I hear the number of years that people have been incarcerated. My role at IPP, after I got tricked to doing all the other things, I was asked to come on as a staff member. I always forget my titles because titles are dumb. Community and Survivor Outreach Specialist. I made that up. I thought it sounded good. They said I had to have a title. I said, okay, well, I'm going to make it up. But what I do is I'm responsible for bringing on people who want to be facilitators, to bring on people who are willing to talk on survivor panels. And the reason why they asked me to do it was because traditionally, I'm not going to speak for Washington, but in California, people who volunteer are not people of color. And so you have this population that consists primarily of people of color, and then the people who are facilitating groups and the people who are telling the stories don't look like them. And so my responsibility is to diversify the facilitators as well as the survivor panels. And I said, well, what do you mean by diversify? And they said, bring in people of color. And I said, well, I actually really know black people. So if you want some black people, I can bring them on and I'll work on the rest of my own diversification. But we've been fairly successful in bringing in more people of color to train as facilitators, to speak on survivor panels, to broaden what we're doing. We do an extensive training. We have phase 1 and phase 2 training. We're developing a training that has to do with racial relations, because again, you can't do this work. If I'm gonna keep it 100 all the time, and you cannot do this work if you're not willing to talk about race. You cannot do this work if you're not willing to talk about the disparity in arrests, the disparity in convictions, the disparity in sentencing. You can't do this work if you're not willing to talk about it. And in the training, that kind of weeds out who's going to really be able to do this work and who's not. Because if you can't stand the hot seat in our training, you're not going to be able to do this work. And that's just being honest and real about it. What else do we do at IPP? We have a number of other groups. Vogue is probably our main group, but we also have a Veterans Healing Veterans group. We also have Next Step, which is after the men complete Vogue. So in Vogue, we have outside facilitators and inside facilitators. Every group has 2 outside facilitators and 2 inside facilitators. And we train both facilitators. And then after men and women complete Vogue, they can go to Next Step, which is like a higher level of doing your own personal work. The other requirement to work with us is you have to have done your own personal work. Like when we facilitate in groups, that's not the place for me to work out my own stuff, right? And oftentimes that's what we see too. And so it's important that people do their own personal work before they come into this space to work with those that are incarcerated. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I want to end with a couple of stories. One is, I spend a lot of time with guys who have come home, like by choice. Like I spend a lot of time with guys who come home. I had a dinner at my house last year, and I looked around, and who was at the dinner? And out of the 8 guys that were there, 6 of them had been formerly incarcerated, and collectively they had done over 100 years. And people ask me, why do I hang around those that have been incarcerated? And I say, because they have done their work. They have done their work, and they understand the work that has to be done to dismantle the system, to dispel myths and stereotypes about who's in prison, what happens in prison, and who's coming home. So that's another important part is when guys come home. Troy, who came up here with me, he's formerly incarcerated. He's been home almost 2 years. He works for IPP too. One of the other important parts of IPP is we believe that everybody has to be at the table. In order to really affect change, in order to do things and do them well, everybody has to be at the table and everybody has to be trauma informed. And that includes those that have harmed, those that have been harmed, those in the judicial system. When you talk about the adversary process, I'm going to end with this story. Because I understood the system, when my son was shot, the police came to the hospital to interview him. He was shot on Friday night. They came Monday night. He's still on a morphine drip. He is high as all get up. He's talking. He's not making sense about things that don't matter. So no, you can't interview him. So I told Oakland PD that I didn't feel comfortable with him being interviewed while he is still heavily sedated. If you give me your card, once he's stable and home from the hospital, I'm happy to call you and we'll set up a time for him to be interviewed. So between that Monday, he comes home, I call one of my friends, a former attorney, an attorney who I used to work with, told him what happened and asked him for advice. Because I know, because of the work that I've done, that you can go in to give an interview as the victim and be arrested as a suspect. Probably don't happen here, but in California that happens. And so my friend Aram said, I'll be the liaison between, my son's name is Vinny, between Vinny and law enforcement. So he contacts law enforcement and he says that Vinny is happy to give an interview. Well, probably not happy, but Vinny's willing to give an interview if we can have a list of the questions that you're going to ask him and if we can have in writing a guarantee that he won't be arrested. Oakland PD didn't agree to that. But Oakland PD told victims of violent crime that my son didn't cooperate. So he didn't get any assistance from victims of violent crime. And that's the adversarial process. If you don't do what we want you to do, then we're going to prevent you from getting the help that you need. That's not being trauma-informed, right? And so, in closing, I want to encourage you all to not give up hope. One of the other agencies that I work for, because apparently I have an infinite amount of time, I have 3 jobs. So one of the agencies that I work for, Californians for Safety and Justice, we do policy work. We're about changing policies. We're about changing laws. We're about teaching people how to advocate. So I want to encourage you, because I heard that you all are doing some phenomenal work from behind these walls. In fact, I heard that there are some people behind these walls that are doing more work than people out there. Those people out there get the side eye. But I want to encourage you to not lose hope and know that we have pushed through some legislation and changed some laws in California that people told us that couldn't happen. Prop 47 is a major one. We got 9 felonies reduced, changed to misdemeanors, and over 1 million people are eligible to get their records changed because of that. People told us we couldn't do it. That law retroactively was set to expire in another year. We wanted to get it extended. People told us we couldn't do it. I think it was Thursday, Governor Brown signed it to be extended for 5 more years. So I say that to you, to don't give up hope. Whatever it takes, legislation to pass to get a parole board, it could happen. It could happen. I'm just crazy enough to believe that it can happen. And the last thing I want to say is, I believe I can change the world. So I told somebody, this guy asked me out, and I was like, I don't really have time to be going out. And he said, well, you don't date? I said, not really. I'm trying to change the world. Not even I'm trying, I'm too busy changing the world. He told me, you can't change the world. And I told him, that's why, one, I'm not going to date you. Right? And I only hang around with people who believe that they can change the world. I only hang around people who believe that they can end mass incarceration. I only hang around people who believe that they can change the hearts and minds of prosecutors and law enforcement and everybody else who has built up the system that has resulted in 2.2 million Americans being incarcerated. I only hang around people who have hope. Thank you.